The sky over Tokyo Bay, 1945, was a flawless, predatory blue. Inside the cockpit of his Mitsubishi Zero, Ensign Kenji Tanaka was not a man, but a release mechanism, a living part of the aircraft's final trajectory. His vision, narrowed by the focus of a hawk, was locked on the immense gray shape of the USS Bunker Hill. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed around him like black steel flowers. The roar of the engine was a prayer. The faces of his mother and sisters were already fading, replaced by a singular white-hot point of purpose. He pushed the stick forward, beginning the terminal dive. A smile, genuine and serene, touched his lips for the first time in months. Then, the radio crackled to life. Not with tactical commands, but with a thin, reedy voice distorted by static and unimaginable gravity. The voice of the God Emperor. Words of surrender. Of an end. Kenji's scream tore through his throat raw against the engine's howl. To his port side, Lieutenant Yamaguchi's Zero did not waver. It continued its beautiful, deadly arc. Kenji's hands, acting against every fiber of his being, wrenched his own plane away. As he banked, he saw Yamaguchi's aircraft become a pinpoint of light, then a silent, distant bloom of orange against the carrier's deck. A perfect completion. A debt paid. Kenji Tanaka did not die that day. He was unmade. Tokyo, 1954. The new city was a fever dream of construction, hammering its way out of the rubble. Kenji moved through the choked market street like a phantom. His stall, Tanaka Precision Electronics, was a cave of ordered silence. His world had shrunk to the smell of hot solder and the precise calibration of resistance. His hands, which once danced with lethal grace on a throttle, now performed microsurgeries on broken radios. The tremor in his left thumb was a permanent guest, a tiny, living echo of that last, aborted dive. His ritual was private, absolute. In his tatami room each night, he opened a small lacquer box. Inside lay a folded cloth, an unfinished senenbari, a 1,000-stitch belt. His mother's stitches were neat, frantic with love. His sister's, smaller, more hesitant. He had never worn it. Now he would take a single red thread and add one perfect stitch of his own. Not for luck. It was a suture, an attempt to close the wound in time where his destiny had ruptured. The watchers came not as shadows, but as contradictions. The first was Sato, impeccable, calm, a man who wore his Japanese identity like a tailored suit. He brought a premium German shortwave radio, claiming faulty reception. "It seeks a signal it cannot clearly find," Sato said, his eyes on Kenji's hands, not the machine. A familiar anguish, the war-forged instruments of unique resolution. To discard such craftsmanship is a sin against the future. A new nation needs guardians who understand the price of the horizon. Not to fall upon the enemy, but to see him. To ensure the silence he so desperately wants to break remains unbroken. He left a blank card. Kenji burned it. The American Johnson arrived a week later with the subtlety of a bulldozer. He filled the tiny stall with his presence. He didn't speak of duty or the future. He spoke of physics. A 2-4 Bull, copied from your B-29s, can reach Hokkaido from Vladivostok in 47 minutes, Johnson stated, his Japanese flat and factual. He placed a grainy photograph on the workbench. It showed a playground in a Yokohama suburb. Children on a swing. A young woman pushing a pram. The photograph was taken from a distance, with a long lens. The bomb it carries is not the kind you are used to. It does not discriminate between soldier and child, between pilot and radio repairman. Kenji's blood turned to ice. He recognized the woman, his cousin's daughter, a child he'd held once. "We have a new aircraft. It flies so high it is virtually invisible. Its only weapon is a camera. Its only target is the truth," Johnson continued, his voice dropping to a low, relentless hum. "We are not asking you to die for a symbol, Tanaka. We are asking you to outlive a threat, to use the one skill your past gifted you, the ability to hold a course through hell for a purpose that actually matters. Your government has already said yes. All that remains is for you to stop repairing the past and start protecting what's left of the future." Johnson didn't leave a card. He left the photograph. That night, Kenji did not take out the Senenbari. He took out a small, tarnished Zippo lighter, a trophy from a dead Marine on Okinawa. He hated its weight, its foreign mechanism. He flicked the wheel. Scritch. Hiss. The flame erupted, a tiny, perfect replica of the bloom that had consumed Yamaguchi. It danced in his dark, unblinking eyes. In its fleeting light, he didn't see a hero or a victim. He saw a tool, sharpened by one war, being picked up for another. The shame of survival curdled into a cold, specific rage. Not at the Americans or the Soviets. At the geometry of fate that kept finding uses for a man who only knew how to be a weapon. He looked at the photograph of the playground, then back at the flame. The quiet in his room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a vacuum, waiting to be filled. Not with the roar of an engine, but with the deafening, guilt-ridden logic of a single terrible equation. Perhaps a life spared in 1945 was not a gift, but a loan. And the collectors, wearing two different faces, had finally come to settle the account. He closed the lighter. The final snap was the loudest sound in the world. The decision was not made, but the man who would make it had just been remade. The first link in a new, invisible chain had just been forged. Okinawa, 1955. The heat was a physical assault, a wet, heavy blanket that smelled of jet fuel, salt, and distant coral. It was nothing like the crisp, high-altitude cold Kenji remembered. The C-54 transport plane that brought him and 5 others disgorged them onto a tarmac that shimmered with mirages. They were met not by soldiers, but by 2 men in civilian khakis, Johnson and a new American, a wiry, sharp-eyed man introduced only as Chief. No salutes, no ranks. The transaction was already complete. Their new home was a cluster of anonymous, low-slung concrete buildings at the farthest edge of Kadena Air Base, hidden behind a triple layer of wire and a forest of radio antennae. It had no name. The men called it the Lighthouse, a place that saw far but was seen by no one. The other 5 were Kenji's reflection, shattered into different pieces. There was Kaito, the former dive bomber ace, whose hands now shook unless they were holding a control column. Young, fierce Akira, who had been a boy when the war ended, his kamikaze training incomplete, leaving him with a fury that had no target. The silent, older Ishikawa, a reconnaissance pilot, who had always been a ghost, and 2 others, who spoke little and observed everything. They were not a squadron. They were a collection of symptoms. The training was a meticulous, psychological dismantling. First, the aircraft. It was not shown to them in a hangar. They were led into a darkened room where a silver, needle-nosed monstrosity was illuminated by a single spotlight. The Lockheed CL-282, a precursor to the U-2. It looked less like a plane and more like a laboratory instrument with wings, impossibly long, delicate, a dragonfly built for the edge of space. Chief spoke, his voice a dry monotone. "Forget everything you know. This is not a fighter. It is a glider with a jet engine. It is unstable by design. It flies in a coffin corner where the air is too thin for lift and too thick for orbit. A 1-knot error, and you stall. A 2-knot error, and you rip the wings off. You will learn to live there. The simulator was a metal coffin mounted on hydraulic legs. Inside, they were subjected not to dogfights, but to a brutal, lonely ballet of failure. Engine flameouts at 70,000 feet. Pitot tube icing that made the instruments lie. The slow, sickening onset of hypoxia, where the world turned soft and friendly before going black. They were taught to mistrust their own senses, to worship the dials. But the real training was not in the manuals. It was in the debriefing rooms, with men from a division of the CIA they were told not to name. The lessons were in geography, politics, and human betrayal. These, said an analyst, pointing to blurred photographs of Siberian airfields, are not targets. They are mysteries. Your mission is not to attack. It is to witness, to count, to map the absence of things they wish to hide. The psychological pressure was applied with surgical precision. Johnson would sit with Kenji alone. "Your friend Yamaguchi," Johnson said, not looking up from a file. "He completed his mission, a clean end. What does his sacrifice mean if the country he died for is incinerated in a new war he never saw coming? You carry his unfinished potential. Use it." It was a vile, brilliant manipulation. It twisted the very core of Kenji's shame into a perverse fuel. The bonds that formed were not of camaraderie, but of mutual recognition. They saw the same hollow look in each other's eyes after a 10-hour simulator session. They didn't speak of the past. They spoke in the technical, sterile language of their new trade: ceiling range, camera payload, evasion corridors. At night, in the Spartan barracks, the silence was punctuated by Kaito's muffled sobs or the frantic scratching of Akira's pen as he wrote letters he could never send. Kenji's anchor became the machine itself. During a night pre-flight walk-around, under the watchful eyes of American guards, he would run his hands along the CL-282's cold skin. It was not a samurai's sword. It was a scalpel. His relationship to it was not love, but a profound, terrifying understanding. In its minimalist cockpit, he was not a warrior or a patriot. He was a sensor, a single, living eye. The final test before their first live flight was not in the air. It was in a sterile room with a two-way mirror. A CIA psychologist presented him with a scenario. The cameras fail. You are over the Kamchatka Peninsula. A Soviet MiG intercepts you. It is faster, armed, and below you. You cannot outrun it. What is your protocol? The old instinct screamed, "Dive! Ram!" The Zero pilot's last defiant act. Kenji's mouth was dry. He saw the Zippo lighter's flame in his mind. He saw the playground. He heard Johnson's voice. "Your only weapon is the camera." "The protocol," Kenji said, the words tasting like ash, "is to maintain altitude and course, to maximize the time the camera is operational, to force them to reveal their maximum climb rate and interception tactics. The intelligence from their attempt is secondary to the photographic mission." The psychologist made a note. "And if they fire? Then the mission is compromised. But the film magazine is designed to survive a high-altitude bailout or crash. And you are not." It was not a question. Kenji met the unseen gaze behind the mirror. "The film is the mission. I am the delivery system." A long pause. Then, a single tap on the glass. Approval. Walking back to the barracks in the oppressive Okinawan night, Kenji understood the final, horrifying truth. They had not given him a new purpose. They had taken his old one the willingness to become a martyr, and had refined it, professionalized it, stripped it of its honor and poetry. They had turned his greatest weakness into a perfectly functional component. He was no longer a ghost of the empire. He was a covert asset, a high-altitude, high-value, disposable asset. The school of invisible men had not taught him to fly again. It had taught him how to be efficiently, usefully erased. He looked up at the stars, impossibly clear in the Pacific sky. Soon he would be among them, not as a soul ascending, but as a man in a pressurized suit, taking pictures for ghosts of a different kind. The alarm tore through the pre-dawn darkness. Not a siren, but a sharp, insistent buzz in the barracks. No words were spoken. Kenji and the others moved like automatons through a ritual now seared into their muscles. The purification was clinical. A shower, a strict low-residue meal, the slow, deliberate donning of the pressure suit. Each layer was a step away from humanity. The rubberized cloth, the airtight seals, the bulky helmet that turned his breathing into a hollow, mechanical roar in his own ears. He was no longer a man. He was becoming a system. The CL-282, fueled and waiting on a remote darkened apron, looked alien under the work lights. Its silver skin drank the illumination, giving nothing back. Kenji performed the walk-around, his gloved hands checking seams and ports. His world narrowed to the checklist, a litany against the enormity of what came next. Chief was there, a silent silhouette, giving a single nod. No good luck. Luck was not a factor in the equation. Strapped into the cockpit, the canopy sealed over him with a final suffocating thud. The only sound was the hiss of pure oxygen and the thud of his own heart. The instrument panel glowed a soft, ghostly green. He ran through the final systems check. Everything was cold, perfect, dead. Sandman 1, you are clear for engine start. Johnson's voice in his ear, stripped of all nuance, was just data. The jet engine whined, then screamed to life behind him. The vibration was a familiar ghost, a memory from another life, but here it was, contained, harnessed. He released the brakes. The silver needle began to roll down the endless black runway. Acceleration pressed him back into the seat. Then, the weightlessness of rotation. The wheels left the earth of Okinawa without ceremony. He was airbound. The climb was not flying. It was a protracted, vertical siege. He watched the altimeter unwind with glacial slowness. The world outside the canopy darkened from indigo to an impossible star-studded black. The sun, a violent, unfiltered orb, rose over the curvature of the earth, a sight no human was meant to see. The beauty of it was terrifying. It was the view of a god or a ghost. He leveled off at 70,000 feet. The briefing maps in his mind superimposed themselves on the landscape below. The Sea of Japan was a sheet of wrinkled lead. Then the coastline of Primorsky Krai, Soviet territory. His breathing, loud in the helmet, was the only sign of life. The autopilot hummed. The cameras, giant, hungry cyclopes in their bays, began their silent, methodical consumption of the landscape. This was the moment where history said he should feel fear, or rage, or patriotism. He felt nothing. A profound, icy clarity settled over him. This was the opposite of the dive. That was a convergence, a burning focus into a single point. This was a divergence. He was expanding, dissipating into the thin air. The ghosts of his squadron were gone. The weight of the Senninbari was 1,000,000 miles below. Here there was only the machine, the mission, and the impossible silent geography of the enemy. Then the first flaw appeared. A tiny yellow light blinked on the panel. pitot heat fail. The sensors that told him his speed were icing over. At this altitude, without accurate airspeed, he was a blind man on a tightrope. The manuals, Johnson's voice, Chief's drills, they all flooded back in a cold stream. He initiated the backup procedure, his movements calm, precise. The light stubbornly remained. His heart rate did not elevate. This was not an emergency. It was a parameter, a problem to be solved. He adjusted thrust based on engine RPM and instinct, the ghost feel of the aircraft through the controls. The CL-282 protested with a slight shudder. He was operating on the edge of its performance envelope, feeling for the stall with the delicacy of a safecracker. For 20 minutes, he nursed the trembling aircraft along its plotted course, the cameras still whirring. The fear, when it finally came, was not of death. It was of failure, of returning with blank film, of being inefficient. The shame of that was greater than any missile. The light flickered, then died. The heat had finally cleared the ice. He had corrected. He had held the line. The turn for home was the most dangerous part. A wide banking arc over the stark, frozen peaks of the Kamchatka coastline. It was here the intelligence said the new SA-2 surface-to-air missile batteries were being tested. He was a silver insect crawling across a microscope slide. His radio scanner, set to Soviet military frequencies, erupted with a burst of frantic, encrypted chatter. Then, a clear voice in broken English, heavy with static. Unidentified aircraft. You are in violation of airspace. Identify yourself. Descend immediately. Kenji said nothing. He increased the rate of his turn ever so slightly. A new sound entered his world. A faint, persistent ping on the radar warning receiver. A search radar had locked onto him. It was a cold, electronic eye opening in the void below. He visualized it. A dish swiveling, painting him with invisible light. He waited for the faster, more urgent tone of a fire control radar. It did not come. They could see him. They could not yet reach him. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The pinging was a metronome, counting down the seconds of his invisibility. He was no longer a pilot. He was a data point in a Soviet air defense log. A blip. An anomaly. Then, the coastline of Hokkaido appeared on the horizon, a smudge of green and brown. The pinging faded, then stopped. The Soviet voice vanished from the radio. The silence that replaced it was heavier than before. The descent was a slow bleeding of altitude. As the air thickened, the aircraft became responsive, alive again. When he finally crossed back into sovereign Japanese airspace, there was no fanfare, just a change in the radio frequency. Sandman 1, this is Lighthouse. Read you 5x5. Report status. Lighthouse, Sandman 1, mission nominal, systems green, returning to roost. His own voice sounded alien to him, flat, devoid of triumph or relief. The landing was a whisper, the long wings kissing the tarmac of the secret strip. As the canopy opened, the real world rushed back in. The smell of fuel, the humidity, the distant sound of a generator. Ground crew in coveralls swarmed the plane, not to greet him, but to extract the film magazines from the belly. They moved with the urgency of surgeons retrieving a vital organ. Kenji climbed out, his body aching, his suit slick with sweat. Johnson was there, waiting. He didn't look at Kenji's face. He watched the film canisters being carried away. "Good flight," Johnson said, finally turning to him. "The pitot heat failure was noted. You handled it within parameters." Kenji just nodded, pulling off his helmet. The air felt thick, soupy, foreign. He looked at his hands. They were steady. Absolutely steady. He had not found redemption in the stratosphere. He had not conquered his ghosts. He had simply left them behind, along with everything else, in the thin, cold air at the edge of space. He had done the job. He had seen, and he had returned. And as he walked towards the debriefing room, where they would dissect every mile of his journey, he understood the true cost. The most terrifying thing about the flight was not the near failure or the Soviet radar. It was the profound, absolute loneliness, and the even more terrifying realization that he had found a kind of peace there. The lighthouse operated on a new frequency after Kenji's first mission. A silent, corrosive tension replaced the focused quiet. Success was not a reward. It was a reset button. The film from his flight revealed new SA-2 sites under construction near Petropavlovsk. It validated the program. It condemned them to more flights, deeper penetrations. Kenji's second and third missions were variations on a theme. The climb, the silent transit, the watchful radar pings, the return. The routine itself became a kind of anesthetic. He mastered the art of existing as a sensor. He could now recognize the subtle, sickening pre-stall buffet of the CL-282 through the pressure suit. He could differentiate between search radar patterns. He was becoming a perfect instrument. Then Sandman 4 failed to return. It was Ishikawa, the silent, older reconnaissance pilot. His mission profile was the most ambitious yet. A long, looping flight over the Sea of Okhotsk to photograph the strategic port of Magadan. His last transmission was a routine position check. Then nothing. Not a mayday, not a spike on the radar warning receiver. Just a void where a man and a machine were supposed to be. At the lighthouse, the silence was a physical entity. Johnson and Chief locked themselves in the comms room for 6 hours. When they emerged, their faces were slabs of granite. The official briefing was a masterpiece of cold abstraction. Sandman 4 is presumed lost due to catastrophic mechanical failure over international waters, Johnson stated, his eyes sweeping over the 4 remaining men. The program continues. The security of the free world does not pause for individual tragedy. But the story in their eyes was different. It screamed of things unsaid. That night, the fragile discipline shattered. Kaito, the dive bomber ace, found Kenji in the hangar, staring at the silver skin of their aircraft. Kaito's hands were shaking violently, not from fear, but from a rage he could no longer contain. "Mechanical failure?" he hissed, his voice cracking. Ishikawa? He could fly a coffin through a typhoon. He checked his aircraft twice, 3 times. He was a ghost before they even recruited him. Akira, the young, furious one, joined them, his eyes red-rimmed. "They are lying. They always lie. We are shinobi for the Americans. Expendable. When the sword breaks, you do not mourn the metal." A new, more dangerous training began. Not in simulators, but in whispers. Kenji, driven by a debt he couldn't name, the debt of the survivor, began his own investigation. He used skills the CIA hadn't taught him, the patience of a radio repairman, the observation of a scout. He noticed things. The ground crew avoiding his eyes. A hushed argument between Chief and a signals intelligence officer he'd never seen before. A fragment of a shredded message in a burn basket, not fully consumed. The Cyrillic characters for altitude and engagement. The break came from the outside world. 3 days after the loss, Johnson summoned Kenji. In the sterile office, A portable radio was playing a BBC World Service broadcast. The announcer's crisp British tones filled the room. The Soviet Union has formally protested what it calls a gross and provocative violation of its airspace by a presumed American spy aircraft. TASS reports the intruder was engaged and destroyed over the Sea of Okhotsk after ignoring orders to land. The Kremlin warns of most severe consequences for future incursions. Washington has denied any such flight, suggesting the incident may involve a stray weather plane. Johnson turned the radio off. The silence was absolute. "The cover story is mechanical failure," Johnson said, his voice low and even. "You will reinforce that with the others. Any deviation compromises the program and endangers every asset." Kenji stood perfectly still. The lie was now formalized. But in that moment, he saw the deeper, more terrible truth. Johnson wasn't just covering up an incident. He was managing it. The denial to the Soviets wasn't just political. It was a signal. It meant the program was so valuable they would sacrifice a man and an aircraft rather than admit it existed. Ishikawa hadn't just died. He had been disappeared by his own side. Paranoia, cold and logical, uncoiled in Kenji's gut. If they could erase Ishikawa so completely, what bound them to the rest? The film was the prize. The pilot was the packaging. And packaging was disposable. He began to watch his own team with new eyes. Was Kaito's rage a liability? Was Akira's fury a crack in the facade? The trust that had been forced upon them by circumstance now fractured into a mosaic of suspicion. He requested access to the mission planning logs for Ishikawa's flight, citing tactical analysis for future evasion. After a day's delay, he was given a sanitized version. The flight path was there, the objectives. But the weather data for the intercept zone was conspicuously thin. A footnote from Signals Intelligence, dated a week before the flight, was partially redacted. It mentioned new P-12 radar deployments along the coast. The designation was unfamiliar, but the implication was clear. They had known the threat profile had changed. They had sent him anyway. The final piece was human. He found the young signals officer, the one who had argued with Chief, smoking alone behind the generator shed. The man was scared. Of Kenji, or of something else, it wasn't clear. "Did you hear it?" Kenji asked softly, not looking at him, offering a cigarette. "The engagement. On the radio." The officer, an Iowa farm boy turned eavesdropper, swallowed hard. He took the cigarette. His hands shook. "It's not what you think," he mumbled. "I don't think anything. I just fly. But I need to know what I'm flying into." A long pause. The generator thrummed. The intercept order was given in the clear. Frantic. They were excited. They got a lock. They didn't just find him. They were waiting for him. Kenji felt the world tilt. Waiting? The new radar, it has a different frequency, a different scan pattern. Our warning receivers. They wouldn't have seen it until it was too late. The officer looked at Kenji, his eyes wide with a shared, horrified understanding. They knew about the new radar. Intel knew. It was in my briefing packet for that sector. I don't know if the flight plan was adjusted. The truth was now a weapon, and it was in Kenji's hands. It wasn't just that Ishikawa had been shot down. It was that he had been sent into a known, upgraded threat envelope, a test flight for Soviet technology, with a human pilot as the canary in the coal mine. That night, during the mandatory group debrief, Kenji looked at Johnson, then at Chief, then at his surviving comrades. He saw not mentors and allies, but a complex machine of pragmatism and sacrifice. He was a component in that machine, a component that had just discovered it was not only expendable, but potentially deliberately placed in the path of failure to gather data on the failure itself. He thought of Ishikawa's final moments, not a mechanical failure, but a sudden, violent eruption of flame and metal in the silent high cold. Had he seen the missile? Had the warning receiver finally shrieked a second before the end? Kenji said nothing. He nodded at the right times. He accepted the revised evasion protocols for future flights. He performed the ritual. But inside, the final tether had snapped. The logic of atonement was dead. The Cold War was not a chessboard. It was a laboratory, and they were the lab rats. The Americans were not allies. They were engineers. And the Soviets were not just an enemy. They were the other side of the same cold equation. He had survived the sky. Now he had to survive the ground. And the only way to do that was to stop being a tool and start becoming something else. A variable the equation hadn't accounted for. The thought was more terrifying and more exhilarating than any mission briefing. The next flight would not be for them. It would be for him. The plan began not with an action, but with a decision, forged in the fire of a friend's betrayal. He would fly again, but he would not come back the same. The mission profile was a poison pill, and Kenji knew it the moment Johnson unrolled the maps. Target: the closed city of Severomorsk, home of the Soviet Northern Fleet's nuclear submarine pens. Flight path: a deep inland penetration, skirting the edge of the new, unknown radar coverage that had killed Ishikawa. The objective: confirm the presence of a new class of ballistic missile submarine. The unspoken objective: to test the Soviets' reaction time, to probe the limits of their new defense grid. Kenji was to be both the scout and the bait. He accepted without a flicker of emotion. He was the perfect instrument. He had filed away his rage, his grief, his shattered trust into a cold, internal vault. He performed the pre-flight rituals with robotic precision. He endured the medical checks, the suit-up, the final briefing, where Johnson pointed to a series of dashed lines labeled Egress Corridors, Contingency. They were fiction. Everyone in the room knew it. This time, during the walk-around, he made a single, imperceptible deviation. Under the pretext of checking a hydraulic line near the portside camera bay, he disabled a small, secondary data transmitter. A black box the ground crew had never discussed, designed to stream real-time telemetry back to Lighthouse. He severed its antenna wire with a precise twist of a miniature screwdriver hidden in his palm. The aircraft would now only report what he chose to report over the primary radio. He had just made himself a ghost, even to his handlers. The climb was a funeral procession. The transition from blue to black felt like a descent into a grave he had chosen for himself. At operational altitude, the familiar clarity descended. But it was different now. It was not peace. It was the focus of a surgeon about to operate on himself. He crossed the coastline, north of Murmansk. The radar warning receiver remained silent. The silence was more menacing than any ping. He was inside the beast's digestive tract, and it did not yet know it had been fed. The camera's whirred, capturing the geometric horror of Severomorsk below. The massive submarine pens cut into the granite, the rail lines, the shadows of leviathans in the cold, dark water. The intelligence coup of a decade. He felt nothing but a cold, academic satisfaction. Then, as he began his pre-planned turn for the egress, the world erupted. Not one but three distinct, screaming tones shredded the silence in his helmet. Fire control radars. They had been waiting, passive, silent. They had let him in, let him see everything, and now they were locking on from multiple vectors. The new P-12 radar net. It didn't search. It waited. Sandman Leader, this is Lighthouse. We are seeing anomalous returns on our scopes. Confirm your status. Johnson's voice was tight, a violin string about to snap. Kenji looked at the panel. The missiles would already be in the air. He had minutes, seconds. He did not push the throttle forward to run. He did not attempt the futile evasion maneuvers. Instead, he did the one thing the equation did not account for. He initiated a slow, deliberate, fuel-efficient climb, pushing the fragile CL-282 even higher, towards its absolute ceiling. He was not trying to escape. He was making himself a harder target, buying seconds, and conserving every ounce of fuel. Lighthouse, this is Sandman Leader, he said, his voice a flat line. I am compromised. Multiple locks. Initiating contingency protocol. He then reached down and switched his primary radio to a different, pre-agreed frequency, a little-used maritime distress band. In clear, unencrypted English, he began to transmit. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Civilian Meteorological Research Flight, Juliet Charlie Niner Niner. Experiencing severe navigational failure. Position uncertain. Requesting immediate bearing assistance from any vessel or station. Aircraft is unarmed. Repeat, unarmed. Crew of one. He repeated it twice. A lie broadcast to the entire listening world. A signal flare shot into the electronic night. In the lighthouse, they would be screaming. His civilian cover was a last resort myth, never to be invoked. By using it, he was forcing a diplomatic truth into the open. He was telling the Soviets, and anyone else listening, exactly what he was not, a military asset. And he was telling his handlers that the narrative was now out of their control. The missile warning system shrieked. He saw them then, 3 tiny sun-tinted contrails, arcing up from the earth like vengeful spears. They were beautiful. They were faster than anything he had ever seen. He shut off the radar warning receiver. The silence was sudden and absolute. He pushed the control yoke forward, not into a dive, but into a shallow energy-saving descent. He began to sing, an old forgotten folk song his mother used to hum. His voice was a dry crackle in the oxygen mask. The first missile exhausted its fuel and detonated harmlessly 2,000 feet below him. The second corkscrewed wildly, losing lock in the thin air. The third, and most advanced, continued its ascent. It closed the distance. At the last possible moment, Kenji deployed the aircraft's secret countermeasure. Not chaff, but a cloud of fine, metallic dust designed to diffuse radar. The missile's seeker head, confused, detonated 50 yards to his starboard side. The concussion wave hit the CL-282 like a giant's fist. The aircraft shuddered violently. A web of cracks splintered the canopy. A warning light screamed about a fuel leak, but the wings held. The engine, though damaged, continued to burn. He was still flying. He turned east, not towards the planned egress, but towards the most desolate, remote stretch of the Barents Sea. He nursed the trembling machine, watching the fuel gauge plummet faster than the altimeter. The mission was over. The game had changed. Sandman Leader, respond. Acknowledge your status and proceed to Emergency Rally Point Alpha. Johnson's voice was a distant, meaningless buzz. Kenji ignored it. He flew until the engine flamed out, starved of fuel. The silence that followed was immense. The CL-282 became a silent, wounded glider. He unstrapped himself, moved to the rear of the cockpit, and manually ejected the film magazine from its bay. It fell away, a black capsule on a small parachute, designed to be recovered from the sea. He then opened the canopy seal. The shriek of decompression, the instant, biting cold of the stratosphere flooded in. He took one last look at the stars, then at the dark, churning water, miles below. He did not reach for his parachute. Instead, he took the tarnished Zippo lighter from his flight suit pocket. He held it in his gloved fist for a moment, then let it go, watching it tumble into the infinite void. He then turned, braced himself against the crippled machine, and with a final deliberate heave, pushed himself out into the freezing black sky. He did not pull the ripcord. He fell, a dark speck against the vastness, in a long, silent arc towards the freezing sea. The aircraft, pilotless, began its own slow final spiral into the depths. A week later, in a safe house in Helsinki, a man with a new face and a Canadian passport received a sealed diplomatic pouch. Inside was a single, unmarked film canister. There was no note, no demand for payment. The film, when developed, revealed the most detailed photographs of Severomorsk ever to reach the West. The source was anonymous, utterly untraceable. Back at the lighthouse, the report was filed. Sandman Leader, along with its pilot, lost at sea due to catastrophic systems failure following a suspected bird strike. A quiet memorial service was held. The program was put on indefinite hold, its existence buried deeper in the archives. In a small fishing village on the northern coast of Japan, a man who was no longer Kenji Tanaka watched the sun rise over a calm gray sea. His body ached with the deep cold he would never fully lose. His hands were steady. The ghosts were quiet now. They had finally been answered. He had not completed his original mission. He had not won a war. But he had done something far more rare. He had stolen a victory from the machine that sought to consume him. He had turned the final suicidal dive into a controlled, precise disappearance. He had given his masters the intelligence they craved, but on his own terms, and at the price of his own erasure. He was not a hero. He was a secret that had successfully hidden itself, a weapon that had disarmed itself. He looked at the horizon, where the sky met the water, and felt a feeling so foreign it took him a moment to recognize it. It was not peace, it was silence. The roaring in his ears was gone. For the first time since 1945, the sky was just the sky, and he was simply a man standing on the ground. It was the only victory that mattered. It was the only one possible.